So let's do the hello and welcome. So for those who are just watching on the video, we're pushing into Matthew 24. We've left a couple of verses hanging from last week. I've gone. I think after the email was sent out, I've slightly retitled it "Signs and Seasons." I think I had ends of the ages plural. You see, because this is, well, you'll see why in a minute as we go through. There's a kind of even if when I woke up this morning, I thought we were starting in Matthew 24 verse 1. It's only in with the prompting from Anne I realized we'd not done the last three verses, and I deliberately ignored those previously because they create a nice transition into what Jesus is about to do. So I was intending, when I was thinking we're going to start in Matthew 24 verse 1, to kind of make back reference to the last few verses of Matthew 23. But we haven't actually done them together in this session, so here they are. So do you remember Jesus has just given that sermon about woes? He's addressing it to the Pharisees, and it's very easy to remember the Pharisees as all anti-Jesus. In actual fact, it's the Pharisaic leaders and the rest of the Sanhedrin who manage the temple who are really anti-Jesus. And Jesus has, as we pick it up, particularly in Luke's Gospel, where he's talking to, once Jesus relocates to Judea, we find him in regular conversation with sort of more mini leaders within the Pharisaic movement who are struggling because they totally get and see the messianic call on Jesus. And yet his way of doing things is radically kind of challenging them. But actually, if you read it in a positive way, you can see them wanting to follow in faith. But Jesus doesn't make it easy for them because he recognizes we need to strip certain styles out, which is why, as we're looking at the woes, although it's addressed to the Pharisees, it's incredibly relevant, all of them, to the modern church, because they are the same kind of temptations which the Pharisees had a kind of a religious style that tended them towards, that can also happen in churches today. But now, as we kind of come to these verses, the conversations now start to be with kind of closer disciples. So the Pharisees, in one sense, in the previous sections, were representing those coming into the church, or who will very shortly be coming into the church, who see something of truth in Jesus but haven't fully worked it all out, and that's part of the process that we find being explored in the book of Acts, the challenges to those things. But here we go into Matthew 23 verse 37. So Jesus speaks in a way where it's those who are closer to him hears it, or some will hear. It's kind of a transition, as I said. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those sent to her. How often would I have gathered you, your children, like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left desolate to you. For I tell you, you will not see me from now on until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, these verses are going to prompt some things in those who hear them. The blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is a quote, probably from the Septuagint, I think it is, of Psalm 118. And in many ways, Jesus has come into Jerusalem in a few days before, when he arrives and they're all throwing down the palm trees and so on. And then he comes into the temple, and I think it's Psalm 118 is actually quoted by the children who are dancing around as well. So here's a strange thing. You're not going to see me again until you experience something that in a strange way has just sort of been happening. And we get a kind of a sense, if you like, of a compression. We're going to come on to the verses in a minute as we turn over into the chapter 24. This idea of there's some things that are already kind of coming to pass and happening, but they're also going to come and be part. There's something about them that also is future, as well as in the more immediate. So they happen once and then they happen again, and I think he's kind of caught perhaps when Paul talks about we are those on whom have come the ends of the ages. or it's not Paul, is it? It's in Hebrews. I think that's in Hebrews. Or the ends of the ages. It's a kind of a plural sense, and that there's a kind of an overlap of the seasons which we progress by faith. Going back to Hebrews, we move those things forwards. We see those things by faith. But we're at these kind of critical junction moments. So there's a kind of a critical junction just about to come up that Jesus is going to address, which we're going to see has very immediate context. It also has some things, elements of it, which seem to have already started when we look at the flow of Psalm 118. For instance, Psalm 118, after saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," then says, "Bind the festival sacrifice to the spurs of the altar." Or the horns, you might see it translated, but it's the bits that stick out on the altar, which of course is perfectly then modelled in the crucifixion. So there's something of the crucifixion and what's about to happen, something that's already started to happen because the kids have been singing "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord" and "Hosanna to the Son of David," etc. And people have greeted him. I think the part of the reason why Matthew includes it here is it creates the transitions. We've closed off those woes, which are kind of the more wide community, and as Jesus is starting to kind of pull things together, he's about to leave the temple. He states some things which hear and percolate some questions in his disciples' minds. So, having left the temple, Jesus was going away. And his disciples come up and point out to him the temple complex. So Jesus has just talked about Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and your house will be left desolate. And you can see, you've got to remember at this point, I was going to say, okay, the passage we're going to look at, which I hinted at when we were praying, is incredibly complex to unravel. And actually, I think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a mistake. I think it's part of the way the Lord actually draws us into an engagement with it. But actually seeing some of the historic and textual reasons why it's also complex is useful too. So here is Matthew. Now Matthew as a writer is writing his gospel when some of these things are better resolved. Not all of them, but some of them have now started to become better resolved. And certain ideas are becoming current in Christian theology based on things that Jesus has said with certain phrases around them. And as we read through his description of Jesus' sermon from the Mount of Olives about what's going to happen at the end of the ages and so on, some of those ideas are pushing their way in, but not everything has yet happened. And there are some key things still to happen because, as I say, I believe Matthew is written before the destruction of the temple, which of course ties into the Jerusalem, your house is left desolate to you. So the destruction of the temple, destruction of Jerusalem is clearly referenced there as Jesus leaves. It's prompting these questions now. And as it starts with the disciples who are still struggling with these things, Jesus has been talking to them about his death and his resurrection. They're still trying to get their head around it. We know they're not fully there yet, because tonight, the night of these events, Mary is going to anoint Jesus for burial, and there's still discussion going on there. The next day, Jesus is going to have the Last Supper with the disciples, and he's going to unpack some of these things more concretely. And we still see people struggling. Thomas saying, "But where are you going?" when Jesus is talking about going away and coming back. And so in the context of the disciples listening, they've heard what Jesus has said at certain ways, but things haven't yet settled in their minds. And here we kind of probably get that idea as they're pointing out the temple this is the temple, Jesus, it's going to be left desolate. And Jesus makes it kind of more explicit for them as they're leaving. You see all of these things, don't you? Truly I tell you that not even one stone on another will be left here, or one stone on stone, so stone on another, will be left here that won't be thrown down. Well, of course, that's confusing, and they're leaving the temple. They're heading out towards the Mount of Olives, and when they get there, Jesus sits down. So he's probably sitting on the west facing, so they've turned around and they're actually looking at the temple where they are now. And the disciples come to him privately, so we don't have any of the wider crowd. And they say, "So tell us when these things will be." You see, they're trying to fully get their heads around these things. What is the sign of your coming? And so we're seeing here a hint, and as I say, I wonder if the idea of the parousia, the coming of Jesus, which becomes more explicit as we get into the New Testament, not because Jesus hasn't mentioned it, but because Jesus explains it more, but in the days that follow what we've just got through here. What is the sign of your coming? But they've and the end of the age. And they're capturing attention that Jesus has already hinted on, that he is going to be, there are various phases to what's going on. They don't fully get them at this stage, but they realize there's something's coming to a head, and they want to have some wisdom on these things. If you go back to Psalm 118, it's a messianic psalm that has the cross in the middle of it, but it's also a kind of the victory one, which we normally associate with Jesus' second coming, him coming as the triumphant king, you see, rather than as a suffering servant. And so they're in that place, and Matthew's trying to record things that at this stage they don't fully get, and so he's kind of capturing ideas, and they ask this question: what's the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And that little phrase, the end of the age, actually the Greek is the consumption of the age. So it's the end of the age or the fulfillment of the age. As Jesus responds, he gives us, and Matthew has recorded for us, an answer to probably three different things that come out of this question, but they're sort of blended together. So very often when we're reading it, we say, oh, this looks a bit like that, but that doesn't look the same as this bit. And so we unraveling the three elements. And what are the three elements? So it's the sign of your coming. Okay, that's one question. The end or the conclusion or the fulfillment of the age, which at one level you see there's several answers to that, because is it the fulfillment of the cross, or is it the completion, if you like, of the completion of the end of the old age, which I see, or I think prophetically happens with the completion of the New Testament canon, at which point then Jerusalem is destroyed. This is a historical take on things. So the Jerusalem and the temple get destroyed, in my understanding of the way the New Testament it comes to us, with the completion of the Old and New Covenant together, which we really see as a single document. They're taking us through a flow. But then equally, there are some things which are, but what about when he comes again? You see, so you've got a kind of a come again moment. You've got a kind of you've got an end of the old age, so you've got conclusion of the old age. You've got the conclusion of the age that they're already started in, because the ages overlap. They've now stepped into a new age, which is about to happen with the cross in a day or so's time. And actually, with that new age, when does that one come to an end? And Jesus' answer seems to speak to all of those things, and people try to unpack them in different ways depending on their kind of instincts around where they put their focus. But actually, if you do that in any one way, you find there are certain things that are very difficult to ignore, that this bit clearly seems to relate to a particular moment in history. But there equally, you could imagine it as happening as the sign of something that's still to come, you see. So answering, Jesus says to them, take heed lest anyone mislead you. So Jesus recognizes that it's going to be very complicated for them to unravel the verses and the things he's about to say to them going forward, because there's a certain amount that needs to still be slightly obscure, because if we know it too clearly, we behave in the wrong way, because we can't explore it with faith. We can't be thrilled by the imaginative and creative ways that God fulfills some of these things if we've got absolutely every single chapter and verse and time code in the mix. Because many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. And you'll begin to hear of wars and rumours of wars. Now I'm going to go back to that, although actually it's come back down here. Yeah, in a few verses, Jesus is going to talk about people coming up saying, I am the Christ, which he hints at. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. They will mislead many. And straight away, we're onto something that has happened time and time again. Jesus has already talked about false prophets with the to Iranians that we baptized, they're very clear. And for one of them, it was part of their own journey out of Islam, was the verses that Jesus talks about false prophets and so on, and seeing Muhammad that way. Now, obviously, this is going out on YouTube, and so I'll probably get into trouble for saying that. But I'm explaining something that was part of his own testimony, as recognizing those things. But equally, there are others who've come along right since the beginning of the church. There's always waves of people. As the disciples are left with a sense of waiting and not having every detail put together about exactly what it looks like when Jesus comes, there are people who've turned up with claims to messianic authority, and there are very, very many people in the world who have been misled by those things, entrapped by systems that take them the wrong way. So Jesus kind of caveats everything with a sense of a warning. You're going to have to unpick these things carefully, but actually, hopefully, the things he's given us give us enough of an idea that we will recognize those false prophets, those false messiahs. And then he kind of highlights some things that are likely to generate in us an expectation or an excitement, but he does so with a little bit of a warning, because you'll begin to hear of wars and rumours of wars. You miss the sense of it starting in a lot of translations. You'll hear of wars and rumours of wars, but I think the Greek is kind of it's more of a process. You'll begin to hear of wars and rumours of wars. So going forward from today, you're going to be in this period where you're going to have an expectation. You have a messianic, you have an assumption of parousia, i.e. the second coming. We're looking for something beyond. And in that place of waiting, you're going to start hearing about things going on, quite big things in the distance. You're going to hear of wars and rumours of wars. Don't be alarmed. All of this has to take place, but the end is not yet. And I think that Jesus, all of this now includes the next bits as well that he's going to mention. So nations rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines and earthquakes in some places. All of these things are the beginning of birth pangs. And it's interesting because Jesus acknowledges there is a kind of a sign in the turmoil, but he also kind of limits the place of the sign, because these are just the beginnings of the birth pangs. There is a new age that is to be birthed. There's something new that is to come, and you'll see these things and it will make you want to speculate. But don't be alarmed. And don't get into doomsday cults If you get into the wrong, see, this always sounds dubious when I say this. If you get trapped in the wrong sort of internet spiral, you'll get constantly fed emails by people who've got proper churches that have all sorts of things that are about to blow up, and you've got to behave in certain ways to do them. So Jesus was incredibly prescient. So that's terrible, isn't it? It's more than prescient. He's speaking as the Spirit is prompting him with wisdom that is still very relevant today. And yet we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking it's only relevant today. People have found these verses speak to them right the way through the church age, because there's something that continuously is trying to give birth, if you like. And so it's not all about the future, put it that way. There have been people who've lived in previous times of war and rumours of wars, global famines and disasters. And actually, are they feeling the beginnings of birth pangs? They might have assumed things, but don't get too concrete about those, because there'll be an awful lot of those. So those themselves are not the big sign of what we're looking for, which is the end of the age. And as I've already hinted at, I think that there are potentially two ends of the age that Jesus is addressing. At that time, so at times when you're beginning to notice these things, where the wars and so on happen, what you will find is in those times of turmoil, they will deliver you to persecution or to tribulation, sometimes is included in our translations. And they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Well, you see, if we're always looking for the future, all of those things have also happened in the past. It happens with the early church, and we read about Paul persecuting and he says, and even getting some stoned to death. Well, Stephen is one of them, and being hated by all nations for my namesake. Well, that we start to see the beginnings of that as is Paul is in Greek scenarios where he's hated by some of the Greeks, or in the old Greek Empire, and then he gets taken to Rome. Because we find a conflict always between the idea of the nation state, the state, and the kingdom, God's kingdom. And it regularly produces situations where we experience persecution, we experience people losing their lives for the sake of the gospel, and just generally Christians being hated and coming into conflict with the nations and the states that run them. And at that time, and again, I'm seeing it at those times where we're seeing, if you like, the birth pangs, but which Jesus kind of warns us from saying too much about. That would be exactly when Jesus comes. But these are birth pangs. At those times, many will fall away and betray one another and will hate one another. So speaking about these things, again, it's very easy because right now, I think globally, we are in a bit of a birth pang at the moment. It doesn't take very long if you go and look on the internet to see another famous Christian who's lost their faith, people falling away, and they write long blog articles about how they saw the light and recognized that they were wrong in their faith. And a lot of it just comes down to they don't like the pressure they're in. They kind of felt following Jesus would always be easy. They don't like being considered to be outside of the thing, and maybe there's some things in life that they would rather be doing that in their Christian worldview would be considered sin. So people do fall away in these tougher times. It's part of the ongoing cycle, the birth pangs that are contractions towards eventually giving birth to something totally brand new. Many false prophets will arise and will lead many astray. And because lawlessness multiplies, the love of many will grow cold. And again, the age we're living in, I regularly encounter people I used to know. I say used to know, it doesn't mean I've deliberately fell out with them. People I haven't seen for a long while. And they kind of, and I hear the sense of sort of the weariness with their faith. It's perhaps the best way of saying it. They haven't perhaps lost faith totally, like we were thinking about a second ago, the previous verses. They're not fully lost faith, but they've lost the enthusiasm for it. The love of many will grow cold. And it comes at these times where there is something of this persecution, something of the contractions and the birth pangs. The thing I keep wanting to get across is it doesn't just happen once at the end of the age. We see it as we go on, and we won't do them this week, but we start to unpack some of the things Jesus warns them of. Well, we see those things happening in the 40s AD, which is when I think Matthew is being written. There's a little tagline which we see next week, where Matthew says, "Let the reader understand." It's probably a reference to the fact that they're actually seeing some of those things right now in the 40s when the wave of persecution comes. They happen again in the 70s, and they seem to have a bigger fulfillment in the 70s because actually the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is destroyed, and not one stone is left on another. But then right the way through church history, as the church spreads out and takes the gospel into nation after nation, there is a kind of a cycle of benefits as the gospel takes hold in the community, and then persecution by the state. You see, so they keep on seeing this cycle. And then Jesus kind of, and this is where I've done remarkably fast for what I think is a complicated passage, probably because we're skimming over the top. Lawlessness, because lawlessness multiplies, the love of many grow cold. But he who endures to the end, the same will be saved. So there is an encouragement of this. You're going to go through. These are things that must happen. They're just the beginning. They're not the actual consumption of the age, the fulfillment of the age, the end of the age, but they are part of the process of getting us there. Wars, rumours of wars, famines, persecutions that cause some people to lose their faith, some people to lose the fire of their faith. And then we get this much more positive verse, which I think is where I thought we'll finish today. which is, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed to the whole earth for a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And so my kind of, if you like, to try and draw wisdom from it, I recognize that there are things happening today that I can see hints of and reflections of in prophetic testimonies, and from the Old and New Testament, from not just from this passage that we're going to look at further next week, but other parts of the latter parts of the New Testament too, but they are not dissimilar in kind to ones that have been seen before. And there are always people who then felt, well, this now is the end of the age. This is the end of the age. Jesus kind of packages all of those as, no, these are like the birth pangs and the beginnings of, and they're part of the process. But the bit that actually represents when the end will finally come is the gospel, and it's the gospel of the kingdom. So it's not the gospel of salvation, which is a good thing, being saved, but it's broader than that because the gospel of the kingdom has a social impact, if I could put it that way. As we're salt and light, the people being salt and light are those who've been saved. They've experienced the gospel of salvation, but the gospel of the kingdom has a social impact. Sometimes we think of it in church history as being Reformation, that there's a significant series of spiritual events and spiritual weight to the community that love and follow Jesus, that society itself gets transformed. And we're seeing now the outworking of the gospel of the kingdom. So suddenly children are getting better educated and have better health. Girls are being better educated and higher valued. All of these sorts of things, even those who aren't believers are benefiting from them. And from the days of the earliest Roman church, Christian church I'm not talking Roman Catholicism, but I'm thinking of the church that goes into Europe. And we have written documents sometimes from the pagan. There's a complaint. This is why I was thinking of it. There's a complaint letter written to Caesar about how the pagan priests can't compete with the Christians, and because the Christians have such good social community life and they don't have the money to compete with those things. Well, it's not that the Christian churches had lots of money. It's just that the individuals themselves participated in something that was transformational of the community. So their health was going up and so on. So right from the earliest days, there has been the sense of the gospel of the kingdom that is broader than just the salvation of the individuals, but is transformative to the whole of society. That's the gospel that is going to be proclaimed in the whole earth. And my own kind of Christian ministry life has been very linked to the emphasis on world mission that kind of started to develop in the run-up to the year 2000, not because they saw that as a magic number, but it was a useful thing to say, how far have we got? And have extended beyond. And we've seen the huge pushback, and at a very broad level, there is a kind of a sense in which almost the entire world is coming under the sound of the gospel, at least of salvation. There are still pockets and so on, and increasingly that second wave of transformation. But as that gets out, of course, we're seeing at the same time the conflict that then comes from that kingdom social order with the state that wants to do it their way, wants to have man at the top. And so you're seeing those things. But if I speak with honesty today, I know there is still work to do to see the gospel of the kingdom proclaimed into the whole of the earth. So therefore I tend to have a level of suspicion of those who've got a timetable that says that on Tuesday next week we should expect the end to come because we've just seen a sign in the sky and so on and so forth. So if we keep our focus that we always know those things will be there, we will always have a tendency to feel our generation is going through it the worst that anybody ever has. That's just, it will always be that way because that's the one we're experiencing. but in actual fact, there are these cycles. What we should be focused on when we're thinking about if we're really looking to see Jesus come again, there's the enthusiasm in his church that has taken on that task, and seeing the kingdom coming in place after place after place. And that's not a burden I can carry as an individual, but I can play my part in the mix. so I can play my part and do my little bit for the kingdom in my streets or my town or in my sphere of influence, and actually I measure those things. Those are the things I want to get excited about. You can hear about, as happened this week, the 50 people being arrested, isn't it, in Iran? But equally, why are they being arrested? Well, it's because the gospel of the kingdom is taking roots there. It's beginning to spread, so the persecution is there. But the persecution isn't a sign that the end is coming. But we should be encouraged by the spread of the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom. So now, as Jesus goes on, as I say, he'll look at other specific things that speak to this kind of transition, and some of them we'll see very clearly were incredibly relevant, have very kind of instant resonance for the early church. You probably lived through some of the experiences Jesus talks about, and others we kind of see by implication are much more deferred to what we think of as the end times. But trying to unravel them, we want to kind of do so with humility and recognize this is a complicated passage to unravel, and that's not surprising because the disciples at the moment don't yet have all of the tools that they would eventually use to describe these things. And when they're listening to Jesus, Matthew didn't record them with those things, even though he perhaps uses some of those to influence what he writes. But there were things that actually have nice quick resolutions. But because Matthew is written before the destruction of the temple, those things don't dominate. And that's my final little point, is that the flow we're in at the moment, chapter 24 of Matthew, and its equivalent passages, particularly in Luke, more so than in Mark, because Mark's a very shortened version. They are the main reason that scholars believe that the Gospels were written after 70 AD, because there are things that come up in this kind of prophetic discourse that so clearly tie in to the destruction of the temple in people's minds that they think they must have been written afterwards. Except the weird thing is they don't tie in so precisely, with the sort of precision that you'd have if you'd waited for the things to happen and then you wrote them. They kind of tie in a weird way where they cover a multitude of things of which the exact way that the temple is destroyed fits, rather than here's something that exactly looks like the way the temple in Jerusalem finally get destroyed. So it's been the comment, I think, which has been made very powerfully by a number of good biblical scholars, is if you look at the early church writings, when the temple is finally destroyed, they are awash with fulfillment kind of narratives. This proves that Jesus was who he was, but you don't get any of that in the Bible, in the New Testament. And the simplest explanation is because it hasn't happened yet. It's almost, as John Robinson, who is a liberal theologian, points out, it's almost inconceivable that the gospel writers would have written these prophecies in the way they did if things that had actually happened, if it was after 70 AD. Rather than, for the same reason that some scholars look at these things and say, well, they look a bit too much like the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple must have been written after 70 AD. He actually turns the argument on its head and says, actually, they don't look enough like it to have been written after it, but they are incredible kind of precursors of it. And he kind of puts that challenge out there as to why, therefore, is there not? The closest you get to a reference is in Revelation, where John sees a new temple, but which might imply that the temple is destroyed, except that he's having a vision, and Ezekiel has previously seen a new temple as well. So it's not Ezekiel saw a new temple. And mind you, actually, having said that, Ezekiel saw it when the old one was being destroyed, I think. But so it might be a hint that Revelation was one side of it, but it doesn't actually say the temple's been destroyed. He's just seeing a new temple, and that's the closest you get in the New Testament to actually referencing more explicitly the events that fit very well into the things that Jesus talks about as being signs of the ends of the age. And in my own putting of stuff together, I see the end of the old age being the completion of all Scripture, Old and New Testament. Now, obviously, if you take a view that the Gospels are written after 70 AD, then they weren't completed with the temple. So in the same way that the Old Testament was completed, you can, if you look at Daniel's weeks, he has a weird split in his that you often don't hear explained. 7 plus was it? God, I can't remember the numbers now off the top of my head. 7 plus the 7 plus 62 to make 69 weeks. What's this little group of 7 weeks, which is 49 years, in other words? Well, 49 years after the edict that rebuilds Jerusalem and the temple was not only complete, but the Old Testament canon is complete. So that little 7 years just floats around. Wonder what that's all about. Actually, if you apply it to the Old Testament and the Old Testament history, at that period, that 49 years after the Jerusalem is being rebuilt and the temple is being rebuilt, Scripture has been collected together and edited into its final form, and the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, is now complete. So I see a nice parallel has become to the end of the age of Scripture, if you like. Which is, as the temple is destroyed, actually at this point, probably around 69 or about that moment where it's all happening, the book of Revelation is being added as the last book by John, and the New Testament canon is being closed. That's my personal take, but I'm kind of sharing it into the mix. So you get the end of that age, but then we're still looking forward to now the parousia, Jesus is coming, and the end of the age. So hopefully that wasn't too convoluted in the 40 minutes that we've taken. Does anyone want to ask anything or make any comments?